The sexual sins of the Spanish Inquisition in the dim corridors of European history, one name casts a shadow of terror across the centuries. The Spanish Inquisition, created in the name of faith and the salvation of souls, it became one of the most ruthless machines of oppression the world had ever known. When we think of the Inquisition, flames, dungeons, and confessions drawn by blood immediately come to mind. Yet there is another side rarely spoken of, but equally haunting: the sexual sins. In this realm, human desire was twisted into a weapon of control, a political tool, and an excuse for unimaginable cruelty. In that era, Spain stood at the height of its power. The union of throne and church forged a system of absolute authority, where every act, every thought, even the most intimate of desires, could fall under judgment. Sexuality was no longer seen as natural, it was bound inseparably to the image of the devil. Every longing, every stir of the flesh could be interpreted as evidence of betrayal against God. And in the hands of the Inquisition, such evidence was enough to send anyone from a peasant to a nobleman. The flames of the public square. In this world, desire was shackled, suffocated, yet precisely because of this, it grew more obsessive than ever before. People lived in paradox. On one side, faith demanded purity and chastity. On the other, human instincts burned silently, impossible to erase. When desire broke through, it was not merely branded as a private weakness, it was condemned as rebellion against the Almighty Himself. And for the Inquisition, rebellion deserved only torture and death. What made this repression particularly terrifying was the way the Inquisition transformed sexuality into public fear. It was not only adultery or incest that drew punishment. Even the smallest gestures, an exchanged glance, a whispered dream, an unintended confession could be magnified into evidence of fornication. Nuns who confessed to having erotic dreams were accused of lying with demons. Men suspected of homosexuality were charged with defying God's will and often tortured to death. Accusation, whether true or not, was enough to seal one's fate. Perhaps most horrifying of all was not simply that desire was condemned, but that it was twisted into a spectacle of torment behind closed dungeon doors. When the Inquisition accused someone of a sexual sin, they employed the most brutal instruments to force confessions: the iron pair, breast rippers, heated clamps, and devices meant to mutilate the sexual organs. These tools were not only designed to inflict pain, but to humiliate, to turn the source of pleasure into the site of horror. And yet, within the very ranks of the Inquisition, desire smoldered. Many judges, priests, and torturers themselves succumbed to the same urges they condemned. Records whisper of inquisitors who exploited their power to abuse victims, of men who preached chastity by day and broke their own vows by night. This hypocrisy revealed the Inquisition for what it truly was: not a guardian of faith, but a grotesque mirror reflecting its own hidden lusts. In this video, we will descend into that shadowed history. We will explore how desire was transformed into sin, how sexuality became a weapon of torture, and finally, how power, lust, and fear intertwined to create one of humanity's darkest tragedies. This is not merely a story of the past, it is also a mirror for the presenter, a reminder that desire, when chained and forbidden, does not die. It lingers, it transforms, and it haunts. When desire became sin in the 15th and 16th centuries, when the Spanish Inquisition held absolute power, desire and instinct, as natural as breathing was, turned into a death sentence. For the Church, there was no distinction between major sexual sins and minor temptations. All were viewed as open doors through which Satan might enter the human soul. Women, particularly those in convents, bore the heaviest suspicion. It was believed that women were more easily tempted, that they served as instruments through which the devil lured men away from God. A lingering gaze, a dream confessed aloud. even a restless night stirred by bodily longing, any of these could be presented as evidence of guilt. Many nuns were accused of lying with demons in their sleep, condemned simply because they admitted to having erotic dreams. Men, too, were not spared. Homosexuality was regarded as one of the gravest sins, a direct denial of God's will for procreation. Historical records reveal that young men, sometimes condemned merely for behaving differently, were tortured to death. In the eyes of the Inquisition, every act of sexuality outside of marriage, outside of procreation, was branded as fornication, and fornication was heresy. Trials of the Inquisition became grotesque spectacles where sexuality was dissected as though it were a crime against heaven. Judges interrogated victims with cruel detail, demanding confessions of who they had kissed, who they had touched, what thoughts they had entertained. Under torture, many admitted to deeds they had never committed. Those forced confessions became evidence, sealing their fate on the pyres of public squares. The cruel irony was that the more desire was forbidden, the more fiercely it burned. In communities suffocated by fear, where every instinct had to be hidden, repression turned longing into obsession. People sought secret ways to satisfy their hunger, and when discovered, the price was their lives. Lovers caught through a misplaced letter or an overheard whisper were dragged to the flames, their execution staged as a warning to all. To the Inquisition, sex was never private. It was a matter of politics and power. When you could control a person's desires, you controlled their soul. Every coerced confession was not only a violation of the body, but also a public humiliation that transformed the victim into a sinner in the eyes of their community. This was the Inquisition's most insidious weapon, to turn desire into fear and fear into obedience. But in this harshness lay a darker paradox. The very men who condemned lust so violently often succumbed to it themselves. Inquisitors and judges used interrogations to exploit and abuse their victims. Priests who preached purity by day sought out brothels by night. The hypocrisy of the Inquisition festered like a hidden wound, outwardly enforcing purity, inwardly consumed by the same temptations. Thus desire ceased to be a private instinct. It became a strategic tool in the hands of the Inquisition. To eliminate an enemy, one needed only to accuse them of fornication, of lying with demons, or of unnatural sin. Such charges could destroy a noble house, strip away honor, or consign a soul to the fire. In this way, during the Spanish Inquisition, desire something as human as love itself was transformed into a weapon of politics, a chain of humiliation and a sentence of death. It was no longer simply an instinct of the body. It became a battlefield where the Church enforced its rule, not through salvation, but through terror. Sexuality and torture, if Chapter 1 revealed how desire was transformed into sin. Chapter 2 plunges us deeper into the abyss where sexuality itself became a weapon of torture. Within the damp, airless dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition, physical pain and sexual humiliation fused into one of the most terrifying instruments of control. Records that survive tell us that crimes of a sexual nature were often punished with the cruelest devices ever conceived. One infamous instrument was the iron pear. This metal device, crafted with 4 expandable leaves, could be inserted into the mouth, the vagina, or the rectum. With each twist of the screw, the pear expanded, tearing soft flesh apart. It was not merely punishment, it was degradation, transforming the very organs tied to intimacy and pleasure into sights of unbearable horror. Another was the breast ripper, forged to torment women accused of adultery, lust, or fornication. Heated until glowing, its claws were clamped onto the breasts, then ripped away, leaving only torn flesh and ash. The Inquisition called it justice for temptation, but in reality it was an act of ritualized cruelty. There was also the infamous chair of torture, its surface studded with hundreds of iron spikes. Victims were stripped and bound upon it, forced to sit for hours or days. Each movement drove the spikes deeper, blood dripping endlessly onto the floor. In many cases, judges demanded that the condemned be publicly displayed in this way, to serve as examples of lust punished. The true effect, however, was humiliation on a scale designed to break not just the body, but the spirit. Most chilling of all was the way torture itself became a performance. Torturers, long immersed in suffering, began to view pain as spectacle, even as art. The screams, the convulsions, the breaking of the human form all became a macabre theater of power. Reports whisper of executioners smiling, even laughing, as the condemned writhed in agony. In such moments, the line between cruelty and perverse pleasure dissolved, and desire itself mutated into something grotesque. The confessions extracted under such torment were never truth, they were survival. Victims confessed to anything demanded of them, whether it was fornication, sodomy, or intercourse with demons. For the Inquisition, the accuracy of confession was irrelevant. What mattered was submission. And the quickest way to force submission was to corrupt desire itself, turning what gave life into what delivered death. Yet within this horror lies a deeper paradox, trying to annihilate desire through pain. The Inquisition only succeeded in awakening the perverse desires of the inquisitors themselves. Behind the piety of the Church, behind the mask of justice, sexuality returned in monstrous forms, lust, entwined with violence, pleasure drawn from screams. Torture for some became not only duty, but temptation. Thus, the sexual tortures of the Spanish Inquisition were more than punishment. They were a ritual of domination, a dark alchemy where the flesh was humiliated, the soul degraded, and power reaffirmed. Sexuality was not destroyed, it was twisted, reshaped into a weapon more dreadful than desire itself. And in that transformation lies the greatest irony of all. When power attempts to strangle instinct, it does not erase it. It mutates it into something darker, hungrier, more terrifying than before. Power, lust, and collapse. If the earlier chapters revealed how desire became sin and how torture turned sexuality into horror, this chapter unveils the final truth. Desire itself became a tool of power. The Spanish Inquisition was never merely a tribunal of faith. It was a political machine, where accusations of sexual sin served as weapons sharp enough to destroy reputations, families, and kingdoms. In 15th and 16th century Spain, honor meant everything. Single charge of fornication or unnatural sin could ruin a noble house forever. The Inquisition knew this well and wielded it without mercy. To eliminate a rival, one needed only to whisper that they had lain with demons, consorted with witches, or engaged in forbidden acts. Proof was unnecessary, for silence after torture was taken as guilt, and screams were taken as confession. The bitter irony was that, while they condemned lust so fiercely in public, many inquisitors and clergy were consumed by it in private. Records whisper of judges who used interrogations to assault their victims, of inquisitors who took advantage of the vulnerable under the guise of justice. Priests who thundered about purity from the pulpit by day sought out brothels by night. Hypocrisy became the rotting heart of the institution, feeding its power while revealing its corruption. Over time, this hypocrisy began to erode the Inquisition's grip. The people saw trial after trial devoid of fairness, watched neighbors burned for fabricated crimes, and whispered of inquisitors indulging in the very sins they condemned. Faith in the tribunal crumbled. The Spanish Inquisition was no longer seen as the hand of God. It was seen as a grotesque theater of lust and domination. Scandal after scandal drove this collapse further. Nobles once protected by the Inquisition's shield were suddenly betrayed, their hidden affairs used as bargaining chips in political games. Priests were exposed, journals discovered detailing their abuses and obsessions. The facade of holiness cracked, and the world saw the institution not as divine justice, but as a carnival of sin cloaked in sanctity. And yet the Inquisition endured for centuries. It continued to burn, to torture, to accuse, but its mask of piety grew thinner with each passing year. What remained was not salvation, but domination power maintained through fear, lust disguised as righteousness. When the Inquisition finally weakened in the 18th and 19th centuries, its secret archives revealed the truth. Within the yellowed pages lay confessions wrung from pain, accusations of sexual sin wielded like daggers, and evidence of hypocrisy so blatant it could no longer be denied. The Spanish Inquisition had not purified society. It had poisoned it, choosing desire as a weapon and fear as a chain. What lingered after its collapse was not a holier nation, but a legacy of terror, shame, and silence. Desire meant to bring intimacy and life had been forced into the shadows, twisted into a specter that haunted both victim and executioner. In trying to strangle it, the Inquisition birthed something far more monstrous: lust entwined with cruelty, power drenched in hypocrisy. Thus, the Spanish Inquisition did not fall merely because of its brutality. It fell because it could never conquer the very instinct it sought to destroy: human desire. Power and lust, bound together, dragged the institution into its own abyss. And in its ruins remains a warning. Whenever power seeks to chain the natural impulses of humanity, it does not create purity, it creates monsters. Looking back upon the shadow of the Spanish Inquisition, we are confronted with a bitter paradox. Born under the banner of faith and the purification of souls, it became instead a symbol of corruption, lust, and the hunger for power. In Chapter 1, we saw how desire and instinct, as natural as breath was, condemned as sin. A kiss stolen in secret, a dream confessed without caution. Even the simple yearning of the body, these were enough to mark a man or woman as traitors to God. Sexuality, rather than binding people together, was turned into a curse, a chain, an open wound of shame. In Chapter 2, we descended deeper, where sin became torture. The pair of iron, the breast ripper, the spiked chair, these were not only instruments of agony, but tools designed to humiliate, to make the body itself an enemy to the soul. Pleasure was perverted into pain, and the intimate parts of human life were transformed into battlefields where the Inquisition carved its rule. And in Chapter 3, we witness the final truth, that lust and power were inseparable. The very men who condemned others were themselves consumed by the desires they claimed to destroy. Judges abused their victims. Priests preached purity while seeking corruption. The Inquisition became not the sword of heaven, but a grotesque theater of hypocrisy, where power fed upon fear, and fear bred silence. The most terrifying revelation is this: desire can never be destroyed. Repress it, and it burns hotter. Deny it, and it festers in the dark. Chain it, and it mutates into something far more grotesque. The Spanish Inquisition believed it could purify the soul by torturing the body, but in truth, it only created monsters within its victims and within itself. Centuries later, we may believe that such horrors are long behind us, yet the warning lingers. Even now, sexuality remains under suspicion, controlled, commercialized, politicized. Modern power still uses it as a tool, whether to manipulate, to blackmail, or to shame. The forms have changed, but the essence remains. And so the question remains for us, watching in the present: has desire truly been liberated, or has it merely been imprisoned in subtler, more insidious chains? The Spanish Inquisition stands as a mirror. It reflects not only the cruelty of the past, but the dangers that lurk whenever power dares to control the most human of instincts. It is a reminder that whenever desire is branded as sin and wielded as a weapon, the outcome is never purity, only fear, hypocrisy, and collapse.